Hey guys, it's been a while since I've been able to post a video, and that's mostly because I've been busy building a new shop. Over the summer, I had a 24 by 36 foot slab poured, and now it's time to start putting together this metal building frame from VersaTube. I ordered what they call a VersaFinish frame, which means that it has extra girts and purlins so I can easily attach OSB sheathing and wood siding instead of the metal that usually goes on a building like this. This should help a lot with condensation and make it look less like an industrial building in my suburban backyard. It also has 12-inch overhangs on all four sides. I went with a 24 by 36 with 12-foot eaves, so I'll have enough height inside to install a 2-post lift. I know this footprint isn't huge for a shop, but considering it's bigger than my last house, I'm feeling pretty good about it. These 3 pallets are loaded with all the metal framing members, hat channel for the girts and purlins, and a bunch of brackets and screws. Taking inventory of everything is no small task, but luckily everything I need is accounted for. I've heard a few stories about missing parts that held up construction, but I guess we lucked out. I found the easiest way to check things off the inventory list is to get it all spread out on the slab. This also makes the whole project seem pretty overwhelming for someone like me who sits at a desk all day. We're committed now though, so join me as I figure this out. Now that everything is laid out, I need to measure for the base rails. These are set so the outer edge is exactly the width of the building, which in our case is 24 feet. After snapping lines and making sure the 2 rails are square to each other, they get bolted to the foundation with anchor bolts. I didn't film that process, but I'll show you how the anchor bolts work when I do the front and back walls. The next step is to build all the trusses. The instructions say to build them on the ground, as shown here. I'm not sure how I'm going to lift them up, but we'll burn that bridge when we get there. The 2 frames at either end of the building are actually called gable ends and are much simpler than the trusses in the middle. We'll build one gable end and use it as kind of a visual jig for the rest of the trusses. Obviously it needs to be 24 feet wide from the outside to outside, both at the top of the eaves and at the bottom of the legs where it attaches to those base rails. After we set that dimension, we'll screw everything together using about 1,000,000 self-tapping number 10 screws. I found it helpful to clamp both pieces to a straight edge to keep everything true as it goes together. I opted for 12-inch overhangs on all 4 sides of this building. It's just a piece of sheet metal that you fold up into the appropriate shape and bolt to the eaves. Super simple, but I'm really glad that I went this route. It should go a long way in helping this not look like an industrial building. So there's one completed gable end. Now we can build all the trusses on top of that. I built most of them without filming the process because I'm kind of racing winter to get this shop enclosed. I did film the last truss, so here's that process. You may notice that most of the frame pieces are wet. I wanted to have the shop done by now, but permitting delays and various other red tape pushed the project well into the rainy season here in the Northwest. Even though everything is galvanized, it seems like we'll be fighting rust until this thing is fully enclosed. Occasionally, one of the tubes is pinched like this and needs to be straightened out. An adjustable wrench makes quick work of that. The collar tie is made up of 3 pieces of 2x2 steel and spans the width of the truss. 12 screws hold it all together. Once it's centered up, these pre-drilled brackets hold it to the frame. I'm trying to brush off as much of the metal shavings as possible, since every one of them that's left sitting on the frame will promote rust. Next we find the center of the collar tie and mount the vertical brace. This is really straightforward, but I did find that drilling the top bracket a little higher than the pre-drilled hole is necessary to not hit the inner part of the bend at the peak. The web braces are mounted 1 inch to either side of the vertical brace and attached to the top of the frame with some 3/8 nuts and bolts. Since my building is being permitted, knee braces are mandatory. I'm not really happy with the way the upper bracket for these lands right on top of the joint and the edge for the overhang, but it'll probably be fine. This wasn't in the instructions, but I'm really glad I marked the lines for the roof purlins while the trusses were on the ground. A purlin every 2 feet will make laying out the OSB roof decking really easy. So obviously we're a long way from the end of this project, but seeing my pile of parts go from this to this feels pretty good. We've been talking about this shop for at least a couple years now, and it's rad to finally make some progress. So here's the part we have to figure out how to lift up the trusses. Lots of people use tractors or lifts to get this done, but I don't have one of those, and at 24 feet wide, my trusses aren't that heavy. So I recruited a bunch of friends to help me out. We ended up with 4 people lifting. 2 of us had long 2x4s with hooks mounted on them, and the other 2 were positioned at the legs of the truss. The first gable end went up easily since it's so much lighter. The truss, however, took some thinking. We ended up tilting it up and resting the bottom of the legs on the top of the base rail extension. That way, when we got the truss vertical, it would automatically slide onto the base rail. It ended up working really well. Until we got to the last 2. There's a small tree just outside of this shot that prevents us from tilting the last 2 trusses up in the same way. So we lifted it up and clamped it to the previous truss. Then we slid it over to its base rail connection and had to lift it straight up to get it to slide on. It's heavy enough that lifting it straight up is not easy, so I stacked 2x6s one at a time until the lift was just a couple inches. This was a lot more difficult than the other method, but it did work. The last gable end just got lifted up out in the yard and carried into its place. Just as everyone left me to square up the trusses and start the horizontal framing by myself, it started to rain. I got enough hat channel on to stabilize the frame, then went inside for the day. But now the sun is out and I can finish up the framing and film a bit of the process. Again, these wall girts are spaced 2 feet apart to accommodate plywood or OSB. I'll most likely be using T111 siding. This would be much easier with a helper, but I found that judicious use of clamps and blocks can get you pretty far. You may notice the weird treehouse behind me in this shot. Just another half-finished project here at the compound, but the interesting thing is the tree itself. It's an apple tree that we unofficially measured at 44 feet tall. The folks over at the Guinness Book of World Records told me that the tallest apple tree they've measured is 39 feet. Unfortunately, we had to cut off over half its height before Guinness could come out to make it official, and that's how we ended up not having the tallest apple tree on record. This post is slightly out of plumb, so here's how we address that. Clamp the level to the post, then pull it plumb with a ratchet strap. Screwing the girt onto the post more or less locks that post into position, and it should stay plumb from here on out. The bottom level of hat channel is really straightforward, but I thought this was a good illustration of how the sheeting edge on the foundation works. The siding will come down below the floor, so it's very difficult for water to get in. I see a lot of metal buildings just sitting on flat, oversized slabs, and the only thing keeping the water out is a layer of sealant along the bottom of the siding. I would highly recommend having a sheeting ledge like this incorporated into your slab. So that's it for the sidewalls. Now for the front and back ones. With a string spanning the width of the building, it's easy to line up the base rails for the front wall. This is where the 16 by 10 foot door will be, so the actual walls are only 4 feet wide on each side. Luckily, this concrete's only a few months old, so the hammer drill goes through it pretty easily. The provided anchor bolt has an expanding collet at the bottom and will wedge itself in there as it gets tightened. No epoxy necessary. I'm putting sill gasket between all the base rails and the concrete to help isolate the steel from the moisture in the foundation. I realize that since I'm building this thing in the winter, it will all be saturated until it's enclosed, but hopefully it dries out eventually and the sill gasket will serve a purpose. The other end of the base rail simply attaches to the sidewall with this angle bracket. From there, we just attach the vertical side of the door frame to the top of the gable, making sure it's plumb. The front and back wall girts are 1.5 inch square tube and attached like this. These flat screws will allow us to mount siding directly to the front wall, but the Phillips head on them will strip out if you look at it wrong. Once the walls are done, the 16-foot wide header goes together and is mounted 10 feet up on those vertical door frame posts. Things were starting to feel a little dicey at this point, so I broke down and rented a scissor lift. Of course, I didn't pay double for the one that could go on grass, so I spent 10 minutes doing this to get it back to the shop. But at $400 for the week, it was worth it after probably the first hour. This thing was by far my favorite vehicle for the week. A couple more verticals to tie the header to the gable end, and some purlins is all the front wall needs. It's kind of wild to me that this is going to hold up that massive door, but I guess that's why I'm not an engineer. The back wall is just like the front, but with no door opening. A few hammer drill holes, some anchors, and a bunch of time on the lift. By my calculations, that means all 4 walls are framed up, and now it's time for the roof. Here are those lines I put on the stack of trusses back when they were on the ground. Again, I highly recommend doing this, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of the assembly alone. Measuring and marking all this while on the lift would have been a pain. And this is part of the roof purlin process. Pretty much just lining up the hat channel and screwing it down with self-tappers. I was expecting some of the trusses to be out of plumb side to side, but it seemed like the wall girts more or less held things where they needed to be. It turns out the 1-foot overhangs on the gable ends are just longer purlins, but I'm glad we have them. At this point, there's an atmospheric river heading our way, and I'm running out of time with the lift rental. My goal was to have the roof completely finished before this storm rolls through, but I'm feeling less optimistic about that. I did get half the 7/16 OSB sheathing on by myself using this effective, if a bit awkward method. But because of the impending weather, my dad and brother came over to help finish up the sheathing and get a weather barrier up there. By the way, big shout out to anyone who's willing to help out with stuff like this. I'd say I've done about 90% of this by myself so far, but I couldn't have gotten it to this point without the friends and family that helped. The process for the roof sheathing is basically the same as on a stick-built building, only with horizontal purlins instead of vertical rafters. To screw the OSB to the metal hat channel, we use these screws. The little wings on the end bore a bigger hole through the OSB, then they break off when they hit the metal. That way the OSB doesn't lift up while the self-tapping end of the screw is working on getting through the metal. A small detail, but when you have hundreds of screws to drive, saving a few seconds on each one is pretty nice. This is the weather barrier nailed down to the OSB. It's obviously not a long-term solution, but it should hold up for a week or two until we can get the metal up here. We didn't have time for the fascia boards, so we left it long and clamped it down to withstand some wind. So I think the next shop video will hopefully involve finishing the roof, framing a walk door right about here, and maybe some siding. Like and subscribe if you're into the shop videos. I know it's a far cry from what I usually do, but enough of you expressed interest in the process that I figured a full video series makes sense. For the rest of you, I'm trying to get back to the regularly scheduled Disco and Volvo content. Plus I got a new car that I want to introduce to the channel. Thanks for watching.